nobody wanted Alex Karp. Now, nobody can ignore him. You probably know what it feels like to be at the beginning of that journey. You've had people dismiss your idea. You've had people not back your position. The thing you believed in a room that didn't believe it back. People may have even called you stupid. Alex Karp, co founder and CEO of Palantir Technologies, spent 18 years being called exactly that. His company is now worth over $300 billion. dollars. And the thing that got it there wasn't just a better product or a smarter strategy, but it was that he actually believed in something when almost nobody else did. Alexander Karp was born on October 2nd, 1967, in New York City. His father was a Jewish pediatrician, his mother, a black artist. His family moved to Philadelphia, where he grew up, and he was severely dyslexic, which meant the entire school system kind of worked against him at that time because there wasn't the type of programs that exist today. It wasn't because he wasn't smart, but it was built around a kind of conformity that his brain just wasn't wired to do. He later would grow to think that his dyslexia is one of the reasons that he was able to do so much because he was used to having to overcome obstacles. He went to Haverford College, a thing that would later become a thorn in his side, then Stanford Law, then Frankfurt for a PhD in neoclassical social theory. He spent years in Germany, spoke the language fluently, and seriously considered never coming back. None of this looks like the resume of someone who ends up running a defense technology empire. He wasn't a techie. He wasn't born in the Valley. He wasn't raised in the Valley, the Silicon Valley, I mean. At Stanford, though, he met Peter Thiel. They argued constantly. Karp was more socialist, Thiel more capitalist. Neither one was interested in performing the things they were supposed to think. That mattered more than the disagreements. Both of them loved to argue, but not in the way like parents argue, but in the way that people enjoy good argumentation, like a lawyer or a philosopher. After Frankfurt, though, Karp started a small money management firm in London. He'd inherited $12,000 from his grandfather. He used it to back businesses and manage money for European investors, and he was good at it, but it just wasn't his thing. Then, September 11th happened, and Karp had a very specific belief that Silicon Valley and the entrepreneurs and tech investors at the time had an obligation to help the United States government, or the West, fight terrorism. The most sophisticated engineers in the world, in the most powerful country in the world, watching their country get attacked and looking the other way because it was unpopular at dinner parties. It just didn't sit right with him. He thought that was a moral failure, not a necessarily complicated one at that, but an obvious one. He called Thiel. In 2003, Thiel, along with three others, co-founded Palantir Technologies, named after the Seeing Stones in The Lord of the Rings. In the lore of Lord of the Rings are objects that will let a person see really far distances without physically needing to be there, which will kind of come to define Palantir in a sense. And the Lord of the Rings thing was neat because it wasn't uncommon for Palantirians to be known as hobbits within their own work structures. The idea was to build software that could help intelligence agencies find and locate terrorists without building a surveillance state, to make the data transparent enough that you could see exactly what government was doing with it. They had this idea that data was super powerful and they wanted to combine and use it in ways that other people really weren't thinking of at the time. Put another way, to simply remove the contradiction between security and liberty instead of the fading of liberty becoming an inevitability. Silicon Valley thought this was naive and embarrassing, and possibly both. For the first several years, Palantir had almost no revenue. And actually, they wouldn't turn a profit for like the first 20 years. And the US government at the time did not want to buy from them. The venture community didn't believe in what they were building. The culture at the time was consumer interest, social, mobile, advertising. And Karp really wanted to make Palantir a thing that would stand against this. The idea that you would orient your entire company around helping the government find terrorists was just not fashionable. And it was sort of a career ending move, but Karp didn't care. Karp knew this and did it anyway, and not because he was necessarily reckless, but because he believed it was right. Early traction came from special operations, soldiers in the field who needed to find roadside bombs before they killed people. They had a program at the time called D-SIGs, and it just was not working out. The product that Palantir had worked, but the army didn't care necessarily. Some generals still wanted to use D-SIGs because it's what they've been using. But Palantir was able to work with certain special units forces, and those leaders, the ones that actually saw Palantir in action, didn't care whether it was cool. They didn't care if it had a fancy acronym. They cared whether it worked and saved American lives. And boy, did it work. The broader Department of Defense at the time didn't want them. The procurement system always had some type of fallacies, but they were supposed to allow fair competition, and that didn't happen. Legacy contractors would go in with 30,000-page documents and continue to lobby, making it nearly impossible for anybody else to come into and compete in the market. which prohibited Palantir from even being able to get their product in front of the consumer. But Palantir had software that was better, but in procurement terms, it was almost beside the point. So in 2016, Karp sued the US Army, which seems a little bit backwards if you want to get the Army to eventually use your product, but it ended up working out for him really well. Every senior official knew him, said, don't do that. The message was consistent. You're going to be blacklisted. You'll never work with the DoD again. This is not how things are done. But Karp sued anyway because, again, he had a belief that he needed these soldiers to be safe. He wasn't trying to force them to buy Palantir. He was forcing them to run a fair competition where the best product could actually win. And, by the way, Palantir won. The government appealed. Palantir won again. Eventually, it was decided that, yes, you actually have to let Palantir and every other off-the-market product be given a fair competition. The discovery documents from the case contain something that Karp has quoted publicly more than once. The government's own internal communications acknowledged that Palantir's product was better, that theirs wouldn't work, and that they had no intention of buying from Palantir regardless. And here's, by the way, where this applies to you, because you've been in that room. You've been in the one where people with the most power were doing something you knew wasn't working. Maybe you said something once. Maybe you got the look, the one that means you don't understand how things are done here. And maybe you made the calculation. The cost of being right was higher than the cost of being quiet. And that calculation is everywhere. It runs through companies, careers, entire industries. The system depends on people deciding their actual conviction isn't worth the fight. So they learn to manage the impression instead. They say the right things in the right rooms, and they get very good at it. But what Karp understood is that this performance has a price most people never account for. An institution full of people performing beliefs they don't have can't make hard decisions, because hard decisions require knowing what you actually think, what you actually believe. When the moment comes to decide and you have nothing you believe in, there's nothing there, and you're left with just a performance that unfortunately ended with American lives being lost. In 2018, Google won the contract to build an AI targeting system for the US Department of Defense, Project Maven. The goal was to use the machine learning to analyze drone footage and identify targets faster than human analysts could. Google's employees found out, and then there were petitions and protests. Thousands of engineers signed an open letter. The pressure was significant enough that Google walked away from the contract entirely. Palantir took it. Karp stated it plainly. He thought that Silicon Valley's refusal to support the US military was a moral failure, that the best engineering talent in the most powerful country in the world choosing not to help the country defend itself was not a principled stand. It was just performance, a way of managing how you looked while the actual work got left to people with fewer resources and worse tools. It's kind of like that scene from A Few Good Men with Jack Nicholson, except for this time, Palantir and Alex Karp is kind of right. He kept saying this, by the way, in rooms full of people who disagreed, on stages where the audience shifted in their seats, in interviews where the questions came loaded with the implication that he was the one who didn't understand. But he kept saying it because he believed it. In 2020, Palantir went public through a direct listing. The stock opened at $10 a share. The skepticism didn't stop there. Analysts questioned whether the business model was real, whether they could actually grow and scale and expand. There was still a lot of controversy about the company as a whole, but also from a business perspective, it looked a little bit tough to sell because Palantir was still running on a model where they would go out and send engineers to set things up. And so there was a little bit of worry on the actual scalability of the company, as there wasn't a lot of remote accessibility at the time. There was also questions of whether the government contracts would last, because certain presidencies would have different ideas of what they want their state to look like and different ideas of what the technologies inside them would be. Whether the commercial side could ever be what Karp claimed was a totally different thing. The critics on the left called Palantir a surveillance company. The critics on the right questioned Karp's politics. Wall Street questioned the valuation. But Karp kept going. He kept building. He was asked repeatedly whether the controversy bothered him. His answer was pretty consistent on this. He wasn't performing indifference. He was genuinely unbothered by this because he had a specific thing he believed, a specific thing he was building, and a long record of being told he was wrong about it and having that not hold up. He said once that the right metric for arrogance wasn't how confident someone was. It was the gap between their confidence and their track record. If you've been right, asserting that you'll be right again isn't arrogance, it's evidence. One of the things that people don't recognize is that Palantir actually has a robust capability to deliver on metrics and big data. In 2020, when COVID-19 broke out, Palantir was actually a fundamental resource used in gathering a lot of the data used to protect and help people. Some people accused Palantir of using the data gathered during the COVID-19 to deport illegal immigrants. However, that was never proven, and also it helped save countless lives by gathering data that used to be pretty impossible to connect. One account has that a person would have a bunch of different data entry points in several different locations that weren't accessible by any doctors in any different locations, but when Palantir came into the picture, it kind of have solved things on a massive scale and saved countless American lives. In 2024, Palantir's US commercial revenue grew 54%. The stock had multiplied more than 12 times from its direct listing. The Economist named Karp their CEO of the year. The US Army, which had fought in court to avoid buying from him, now considers Palantir core infrastructure. And this brings us back to his actual dyslexia. He says a dyslexic has an attenuated relationship to the text. A non-dyslexic reads something and it becomes them. The word shapes how they see the world. A dyslexic can never quite do that. The text doesn't map onto the way the brain works, so you end up processing things in a way that has very little to do with what anyone else thinks. He says this is why he built what he built, not despite being unable to follow everyone else's playbook, but because of it. The institutions that failed, and he watched a lot of them fail at that point, failed because they were full of people who had learned to perform to the text, who had learned to say what the room required, who had no actual view underneath, because the performance had been the job for so long that the view had atrophied. And when the moment came where someone needed to actually believe in something, there was nothing there. Most careers run on performed conviction. You learn what to say and when and who to agree with and how loudly and what positions get you in the room and what gets you thrown out. The performance gets fluent enough that it starts to feel real. And then something hard happens, a real decision, the kind with no consensus answer that will cost something no matter what you choose, that requires you to actually know what you think, to actually know what you believe. Alex Karp spent 18 years being told he was wrong by Silicon Valley, by the US government, by the investors who passed, by the culture that thought his work was embarrassing. He kept building anyway, because underneath all of it, he actually believed something. So, what do you actually believe?